for people to join on, and then we'll get started. Just a couple more minutes. I think we can get started. So today we have the great honor of having Dr. Jeptha Curtis as our grand round speaker. I mean, I cannot do justice to Dr. Curtis because he has been around longer than most of us in the room, and he's a Yale standard for Yale cardiology. He went to medical school at Columbia. Well, he was a college student at Yale. Went to medical school at Columbia. Did his residency in internal medicine at Duke, before coming back to Yale for his fellowship and interventional cardiology fellowship. He has been on faculty since then, is now a full professor of cardiovascular medicine. In this time, he has led national initiatives for quality measurement and quality national measures of quality measurement and quality improvement at both internally, but more importantly, for the National Cardiovascular Disease Registry of the ACC. He has also led the ACC's widely accredited Data Analytics Center at Yale since for the last 15 plus years before handing the charge off to us when he became a chief science officer of the NCDR at the ACC and took on the directorship of the cardiovascular catheterization laboratory at Yale. And he has the most expertise of anyone you would know in the pragmatic nature of clinical registries. And with that, I hand him off to for clinical registries and cardiology, impactful past and uncertain future. Thanks.
Thanks, Rohan. I appreciate it. Yeah, it makes me feel a little bit old. So let's see if I have control. Okay, so my only disclosure, salary support from the ACC and NCDR for my work as the chief scientific advisor. So I thought it'd be worth, I don't know if anyone's done this yet, but just to take a minute to kind of acknowledge the loss in the room, which is the passing of Dr. Zaret, who was truly an institution here. And I always think of him particularly at the cardiology grand rounds because he had a very specific seat right to the right in front of where Bob's sitting now. And he and Franz would sit there and kibitz and make insightful comments. And it was just not CGR without Barry. So he'll be missed, but he set the standard for all of us. So I'm going to talk a lot about the NCDR, and I apologize in advance. So when Rohan asked me to give a talk, I was like, what do you want me to talk about? I just gave a similar talk last year for purposes of the cath lab director interview process. And so I kind of threw everything there. So everyone should or probably did hear most of what I've done over the last couple of decades. But I thought I would take the opportunity rather than repeat that conversation to sort of move to a different aspect of what I do, which is within the NCDR. It's taking a lot of time to sort of think about what should we be doing And I love to start with this quote, which really reflects the why of what registries do. So science tells us what can be done, guidelines what we should do, registries what we are actually doing. And that's the fundamental gap that we've had up until the formation of the robust sets of clinical registries that we do have, not just with the NCDR, but also within the Society for Thoracic Surgery, the American Heart Association, and the Society for Vascular Surgery. I attribute this quote probably unjustly to Ralph Brindis, who's a friend and mentor, but really led the development and the expansion of the registries from its very early days. So we actually are hitting 25 years this year. So it's our quarter century anniversary. Is that silver anniversary? And thought it'd be worth going back a little bit into the history of it to talk about how we got here. So the NCDR was born out of a quest to determine if metrics data collection and outcomes analysis could improve the quality of healthcare. And it was actually quite revolutionary at the time. There hadn't been a lot of work. STS had already established their data registry, but the ACC hadn't. And with the explosive growth of catheterization and percutaneous coronary interventions, there was growing recognition that we just didn't know what was going on. It was complete black box. There was no good way for individuals, hospitals, systems, or payers to know how these procedures were being performed, what was being achieved, what was the quality of these procedures. So the ACC formed a database committee, and then they collectively envisioned what would be the ACC's first foray into the registry space, which became ultimately the CAP-PCI registry, with the goal of using this or creating a tool for improving quality. Bill Weintraub, who was the first president or leader of the CAP-PCI registry, noted that the future of medicine is increasingly in the hands of those who are effective users of clinical data. And I think that statement is as true today as it was 25 years ago. You might argue we haven't evolved as fast or as effectively as we should have, but I think we're on the cusp of a data revolution. So the NCDR, the goal of it is through the capture and reporting of reliable data to help participants measure, benchmark, and improve cardiovascular care. Its primary goal is to inform quality improvement at the provider and institutional level, but it also has synergistic roles in terms of disseminating best practices, improving care both nationally and internationally, and then has a research component to allow the evaluation of practice patterns and particularly the adoption, utilization, and effectiveness of novel devices, and to promote comparative effectiveness research across a broad range of medications and devices. So where has it gone over 25 years? Well, it is currently, I think this is still true, the largest, most comprehensive outcomes-based cardiovascular patient data repository in the world. We've been doing this for 25 years. There are currently 7 registries that are run entirely through the NCDR. There are 2 additional or 3 additional collaborations regarding peripheral procedures. What was previously the PVI registry merged with the VQI effort to have a combination. And then Veradigm took over the control of the ambulatory registries, the Pinnacle Registry and the Diabetes Collaborative Registry. Collectively, though, this represents 95 million patient records. The growth of the registries has expanded not just within, but across the suite of cardiovascular care. So starting with the CAP-PCI registry, and sort of with a not quite metronomic gate, we've increased the types of procedures that we're capturing as well as the types of conditions. So it's fairly broad, at least in the procedural space. There are not a lot of procedures that aren't being measured with our suite of registries. And again, you look over the numbers, the sheer magnitude of this. This is 95 million patient records. Most of those came through the passive acquisition of EHR data in the ambulatory registries, Pinnacle and Diabetes. But I focus on the hospital-based registries, where there's 22 million CAP-PCI registries, 2 million ICD implant being captured, on 1,500 chest pain MI patients. Each of these probably represents about 30 hours of work to abstract and submit the data. So if you think about that, at the order of 25, 26 million patients, this is literally millions of hours of human effort to acquire this highly curated data. So how do hospitals participate in the registry? Well, it's a fairly simple process, which makes it easy to sign up and hard to escape. The first is to execute a participation agreement to say we want to participate, and there's a contract that they're actually going to sign. Then the hospital has to select how they're going to submit the data to the registry. So we have certified software vendors that are approved for specific registries. And as an alternative approach, the ACC does offer online options for direct uploading of data. Once their processes are set to get the data up to us, they do have to submit the data, and then we provide them the online benchmark reports as well as all the other benefits that come with participation. Once that contract is signed, they are committing to submitting data on an ongoing basis for consecutive patients. And that's in the contract. If they violate that contract, which really hasn't ever happened, hypothetically, they could be expelled from the registry. Through the abstraction and curation of this patient level data, it's then submitted to the NCDR, and it has sort of three main purposes, but a lot of other smaller efforts as well around benchmark reporting, quality improvement, and clinical research. And I'll touch on, I think, all of these over the next few slides. What's important to understand is, particularly as they get into the tensions of the registries and what we're going to do over time to maintain their health and perhaps improve and increase the size and breadth of it, is that it's serving many different purposes, right? The primary customer here are the hospitals and practices that submit the data. But within that ecosystem, we have the healthcare systems, and increasingly healthcare systems are taking a more direct look at the data and trying to accumulate it at the system level and be able to break down and see what's going across their entire system of hospitals. States similarly have active contracts with the NCDR to have line of sight as to what care is being delivered within the boundaries of their state. Obviously, we have an obligation to the public and our patients whose data is being used. Payers, federal agencies, the scientific community, as well as individual clinicians. All of these are our customers, and it's quite hard to sort of balance sometimes the competing interests of these different consumers of our data. The real strength of the NCDR is the quality of the data. And I'm going to come back to the quality reporting efforts in a minute. But for each registry, there is a somewhere between 3 and 7 page case report form that gets filled out for every patient. And it captures really the full breadth of information of that index hospitalization. Demographics, the history and risk factors, procedural information, very detailed information about what procedures are being, or what devices are being used within procedures, some lab data, in-hospital post-procedure events, and discharge status. In addition, for selected registries like left atrial appendage occlusion registry or the TVT registry, we have follow-up modules, and then selected registries like TVT, and on a voluntary basis, the CAP-BCI registry do capture or provide a form for capturing patient-reported outcomes. So the primary thing that we give back to our participating sites are our benchmark reports. So they contain different aspects that try to capture the slippery concept of quality, but structural things, process measures, and outcomes measures. And through providing this information to sites, as well as benchmarking against their peers, ideally, sites can identify opportunities to improve. So they get their comprehensive outcome reports that have these processes of care, appropriate use metrics, and risk-adjusted outcome metrics. They also have their comparison groups of like facilities, national performance, as well as customizable fields so they can compare themselves to who they feel they should be compared to. And then we have active online registry dashboards that allow us to drill down to the patient level and create unique comparative groups. The hospital dashboard reports used to live in PDFs that would get sent to the sites on a quarterly basis. We've moved to something that's a lot more live, where we have hospital dashboards that are refreshed weekly with national aggregates of the updated quarterly data. So essentially close to live, with executive summary metrics and benchmarks. Again, the ability to drill down to the patient level to identify what was driving variations in care, custom comparisons, detail lines, and importantly, export capability, which we're trying now to improve so we can actually feed these directly into PowerPoint presentations to make it easier for the consumers of our data to get that information out to their consumers and constituents. For each line of the registry, for each metric that we do, we provide these benchmarks. So each hospital can see where it stands. For example, on this left ventricular systolic dysfunction patients who were prescribed an ACE or ARB therapy. So this is, I think, from the ICD registry. Yep. So in this particular example hospital, 80% or 79% of the patients treated at that hospital who were eligible for that measure received an ACE or ARB. You can see that compares favorably. They're not better, but no worse than the national average. But certainly there's room for opportunity compared to the top performing hospitals on this individual metric. So as an example, we have the ability to compare and contrast and identify opportunities. And this is repeated for probably 45 different metrics for CAP-BCI, and then a host, literally in hundreds of measures across the suites of registries. So we're trying to get this data in the hands of users more easily. Again, I mentioned before that it used to be PDFs that would be downloaded by the registry site managers at individual hospitals and never really knew what would happen thereafter. So it could be that they disseminated the information, might be that they didn't. It was sort of unknowable and unknown. Now we're trying to, again, democratize this data so that the hospitals have these live dashboards, but we also have the ability as physicians to log in and see the metrics that are relevant to us. Has important implications for pay-for-performance programs like MIPS and macro. And then trying to get down to the mobile space where we actually have the professional data portfolio that allows me or any individual right now with interventional cardiologists and electrophysiologists to see, again, within a weekly updated version, where they stand on the metrics that they select for themselves as being important. So the data is very well defined, the individual elements. And then the other component of data quality is it accurate? And so this is really the heart and soul of the NCDR, what distinguishes it from a lot of efforts. So a lot of the data quality and curation is automated, right? It's based on whether or not fields are missing or not missing, whether or not they're reasonable or believable values. And sites go through this typically 2 or 3 submission cycles to get to a passing grade where they actually are established their data is green, which makes them eligible to receive the risk-adjusted benchmarks. In addition, though, and I think this is what really distinguishes the program, is that it's part of a larger data quality program post-submission. So every year, the NCDR invests in a data audit program where 5% of sites and 10% of cases at those sites is abstracted, usually at this point remotely. It used to be on site, to evaluate the accuracy and reliability of the data that's being submitted, to assess that, make sure that all eligible cases are actually being reported, that ongoing consecutive component. And that in addition, we have the data outlier program. We actually have mechanisms of flagging sites that have unbelievable results. So if you've done 1,000 TAVRs and you don't have any complications, we'll flag that. That's an extreme example, but it has happened. And actually that type of effort is very useful in maintaining the integrity of the data. And then finally, for selected registries, specifically TVT and the left atrial appendage occlusion registry, we have adjudication to verify and provide additional information for key events, usually for those registries, or in this case, those registries that are tied to governmental payment programs through coverage with evidence development decisions. So as an example of an audit, the scope of it, so the NCDR ICD registry audit from 2016, data was collected for the prior calendar year at 54 sites, 54 variables at 130 facilities. Most of it was done remotely through accessing the EHR. And then in terms, I don't have the ability to share kind of the line by line data, but in terms of consecutiveness, there was perfect or near perfect consolidation or concordance with the number of sites or procedures that had been performed and the number of procedures that were reported and updated to the ICD registry. Overall, the fidelity of the data is very high, usually exceeding 91, 92% for individual elements. So The NCDR, in addition to being useful for the hospitals, is also increasingly a national solution. So all or many of the chapters of the ACC actually have what we call state e-reports or electronic reports that summarize the status of procedures being performed within the boundaries of that state. Sometimes that's just with the chapter. Sometimes it actually takes an extra step and is part of a contracting effort with state departments of health. And we also have pursued a pretty aggressive strategy of entanglement, which is how do we push hospitals to participate in our registries and to stay engaged. And to do that, we've actually focused on a few things, including use of the data for public reporting. And specifically, if you choose to publicly report your data within the ACC, NCDR registries, you will get extra points towards your US News and World rankings, which is, at academic centers at least, a very potent mechanism for getting them to participate in public reporting. In addition, this data is often used for pay-for-performance programs, specifically Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shields, I think now called Elevance, uses as part of their QHIP program payment bonuses or subtractions based on NCDR data. So I've tried, and I sound like a salesman, I know, we'll get to some more interesting stuff eventually. But we have at 25 years, a relatively mature suite of offerings that really, hopefully, is identifying or meeting the needs of our customers. So why do institutions participate? I've sort of touched on this already, but I think the primary is, of course, data access and quality improvement. So having the access to the measures, having the benchmark to comparator sites, being able to monitor key performance indicators at that institution, and using that information to improve the outcomes of their patients. There are secondary drivers as well. There are recognition programs that differentiate them within the market, that demonstrates the value of the care that they're delivering to payers and consumers. I mentioned public reporting, the effort with US News and World Reports. Then there's the patient care, the research component to it. So a lot of sites or individuals within the sites are interested in the outflow of the data through the registry piece. And that was, for example, a big part of why we ended up starting to participate with the NCDR registry. Part of it was a mandate from the government, but part of it was also they had a physician champion, myself and others within the organization, who felt that this needed to be a priority so that we would have access to the research arm of it, as well as to drive improvements in quality of care. So it's hard not to talk about what the challenges are to the registry without acknowledging what its impact is within the college financially. And so this is publicly available from the ACC's annual statements. But this shows on the left the revenues from the various streams within the college. And on the right, the expenses associated with those key operating committees. And it's pretty stark. The NCDR in isolation is responsible for 41% of total college revenue. And it is responsible or requires about $28 million of expenses. The difference between that is margin. And if you calculate that, I'm not going to do it for you, that's a pretty significant part of the whole entire college's margins. And so it has come to a place where it is actually underwriting many of the efforts of the college in other arenas that may not have such a healthy margin. The dependence on that creates tension because the college needs and wants to maintain this revenue stream, but they also need and want that revenue stream to, they're worried about the risk to the revenue stream, but they're also worried that if they don't have the margin on it, that they're not going to be able to invest in the other programs. So it gets a lot of attention, as it should. And the question is, what are we going to do? How are we going to maintain that going forward? So many of you in the room know John Spurtis. He's a health services researcher. He's been doing this for a long time and as a colleague and friend, but he speaks very bluntly. But he wrote an editorial that was published last year that was trying to raise concerns, or did raise concerns, about what the registry is being used for, how sustainable is it going to be. And he wrote it fairly diplomatically here. He was a little less diplomatic when we talked on the phone, but it said, raised the question, I don't think the NCDR is being optimally recognized or exploited. The more hospitals perceive this as being really valuable to the way they do business, the more likely they are to be happy to participate and pay for the data collection that the NCDR requires. And I think the converse of that is they're not happy with the outcomes that they're getting, or the benefits that they're receiving from the registry compared to the cost of participation. And I'd say that the threats to the NCDR model are real. There's no doubt about it. And I think many of them are being precipitated or exacerbated by COVID, but it's part of a larger trend and threats to this business model that we have developed very successfully over time. So first off, for COVID, the changes to the cardiovascular time, the abstractors, those people whose lives are spent immersed in the data for these registries, were frequently either furloughed, laid off, or moved to clinical positions within the registry or within participating hospitals. And then maintaining or retaining effective staff in the setting of the Great Resignation has also been challenging to sites. And most importantly, the financial pressures on hospitals is making them, as we've all felt here at Yale New Haven Hospital, looking at very intently at every line item and trying to identify what is the return on investment for this particular outlay of cash. Are we getting what we need? There are other threats. And again, I mentioned this is there are evolution over time. The concern is that the NCDR is going to be this dinosaur, and there'll be a little bit of in a museum somewhere as to what we used to do, but do no longer. The competition I see in sort of 4 different venues. First, other professional societies. And so lots of societies are interested in doing this research. The margins that the ACC develops are very attractive. And so there's space and sort of a tango that's done oftentimes with the AHA around registries and who's going to do what, who's going to compete, and who's going to succeed. But probably the bigger threats are from external forces, non-professional societies. So certainly any tech company could do this very easily, right? They could abstract data. This is their expertise, and the resources that they can bring to bear on the automatic extraction of data from the EHRs is something that we can never compete with. Similarly, EHR vendors, which I guess technically could be called a tech company, but they seem to operate a little differently, could do this if they wanted. And so those are 2 of the groups that could do it. Question is whether or not they would want to do it. And I don't think that it rises to the level, the margins aren't that high for them. The investment energy of activation is probably a little too high for them to want to get into this space. However, hospital systems are probably a real threat to at least the NCDR model. So as we consolidate to larger and larger healthcare systems, groups like HCA or Ascension Health or Trinity Health, any of these hospitals that have a quorum of probably about 100 hospitals or so, could do something very similar to what we do for a reasonable price and without any energy of activation. So I think those are the competition that I see for us going forward. The other threats are really around consumer satisfaction. I mentioned the downward financial pressure of that hospital strains under, or that hospitals are straining under, and specifically the costs of data abstraction. So the cost of participating in the registry is trivial. It's usually somewhere between $3,500 and $15,000. The cost of data abstraction to submit those cases to the registry is like tenfold that high. So that's where the real cost of participating in these registries are. So as hospitals are feeling the squeeze, these are perhaps the programs that they're going to be interested in pushing or removing from their line items. The other concern is entanglements. So I mentioned that we've been very successful in entangling ourselves with different drivers for hospitals to participate. And probably the best example of that is with CMS and the coverage of evidence development. So as new devices have come to market or with new indications for existing devices like ICDs or transcatheter valves or left atrial appendage occlusion devices. The CMS has always recognized, or has at least for the last 20 years recognized, that the data is not complete at the time of approval by FDA or even by approval for payment by CMS. And so that's led to these CED decisions, these coverage with evidence development decisions that have functionally mandated participation in one of the NCDR registries. There are risks to this, right? It's great because it forces huge numbers of sites to participate. That generates revenue, which is great. It generates data, which is good. It meets the needs of developing this evidence. But political winds can change. The coverage with evidence development decisions can change over time or go away completely. And so the example of that is with the ICD registry, which was under a CED decision for, I think, 11 years total. It went away in 2017. And over time, it's been sort of the market speaking as to what's the value of that registry to those hospitals that had been participating under a mandate. And at this point, 5 years out, we're fairly steady state at 60% retention within the ICD registry. How you look at that depends on if you're an optimist or a pessimist. The pessimist would say we lost 40% of hospitals that had been participating in this registry. This is terrible. The optimist would say 60%, nearly 2/3 of the hospitals that participated had enough value that without any enforced entanglements were continuing to invest in this purely for the return that they were getting on quality improvement. One of the hard things for making these cases to hospitals is that the cost of quality isn't always apparent, right? It's very easy to add up the cost of participation in registries, the abstractors, the registration fees, some travel things, some IT costs and things like that. That's very apparent to a hospital administrator. What's a little bit more challenging to identify is what's the cost of not making that investment. And so that's something that we as a group, as an organization, need to do a better job of how do we help hospitals make that case, or help the registry participants make that case to the hospital administrators, make that value equation more obvious. And finally, the last threat that I'll talk about is sort of the challenges of running a business within a nonprofit, which is certainly something that I hadn't really experienced before. But there, the ACC is a organization. It's a complex organization with lots of stakeholders. There's competition within the college for resources, and specifically around making the technology investments that we need to maintain our position. And because of the importance of the suite of registries to the bottom line of the college, there is, in terms of, some would say, a limited appetite for risk. So people don't want to rock the boat, yet the concern is if we don't evolve, what will happen over time? So to kind of meet that, some of these threats, we're continuing to work on how to optimize our foothold and solidifying our core business, to figure out if there are adjacent opportunities that we can expand our book of business, and are there any transformational opportunities. And what we've really focused on the last 2 years, 3 years now, is to figure out even how to invest our time and our resources for each of these domains, right? We've decided that probably 70% of what we do has to be focused on the core business. How do we do that? 20-25% on adjacent businesses, and then 5 to 10% on transformation. Where do we think we need to be? Well, I think it's articulated pretty well within the mission, vision, and strategic goals of the NCDR at present. So our mission is to improve patient care and heart health through trusted real-world evidence, to achieve a vision, a world where NCDR advances patient care outcomes and value through knowledge and innovation. To do that, to maintain our position, our strategic goals are to reduce the burden and enhance the scope of data collection, to increase the NCDR value to stakeholders through providing and meeting their needs, to promote quality improvement, and to support population health management. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of what that looks like. But this whole plan has been sort of distilled into the optimization plan, which is 13 unique strategically aligned programs within the NCDR that comprises 79 projects over a 3-year period of time, focusing on supporting the core, enhancing our value, and driving growth within the registry. What does that look like? Well, here are the priorities for us. Identifying novel technology partnerships, modernizing our technology platform, diversifying our data sources, enhancing entanglements when the option arises, to be aware of what's going on with the market research, particularly around ambulatory surgical centers at the moment, expanding our advocacy efforts, transforming the R&P committees and disseminating research, and all of this in service of keeping the NCDR relevant in a value-based care environment. So probably the biggest conundrum that we have, the biggest tension, is around the curation of the data, right? So I've talked about how the strength of the registry is the fact that the data is very highly accurate and the fidelity is high. So how do we maintain that yet lower the burden of data collection to our sites to reduce the cost of their participating in the registry? So we do have enacted a few steps to start this process. So first off, we've eliminated the fluff. All data elements have to be used in some form of benchmark reporting. There are no research-only elements. The second thing is to identify establish different levels of potential participation. The best example of this in the TBT registry, there's both a lean form as well as the full form, and hospitals can select which one they want and what types of metrics they would like to receive. And we're also partnering with tech companies to reduce abstraction time. Probably the one that's most fully developed is the CARDA Innovation Project, which is a startup from California that came out of Stanford Hospital, where they're using AI and NLP to minimize the cost and time associated with abstracting data. And the question, though, and Rohan's probably much more well-equipped to answer this, is can we or should we try to evolve the registries to a fully AI-driven data collection platform? And I do have the sense of inevitability that this is where we're going to have to go. This is where it's going to need to be. But there is the concern around the generalizability of any AI mapping. Any health system that you go into, any hospital, even any section within a hospital, the mapping is going to be kind of different. And maintaining that and making sure that all health systems are doing it in the same way is something of a tall order. And so I think there is the potential that if we go that direction, we could lose the thing that's fundamental to our value, which is that the data is being abstracted using very specific definitions that are repeatable across sites. So it could compromise the validity of our benchmarking reports, and then the whole castle comes crumbling down. So let's talk about quality and what we're doing with quality. So mentioned that this is the heart. This is what we do, is we provide quality assessments back to hospitals. And certainly we do a little bit with structural measures, but most of what we do is around process measures and outcomes measures. And we do a really good job with things like medications, door-to-balloon times, referral for cardiac rehabilitation. We're doing increasing work around more complex outcomes measures like mortality, readmissions, complications like acute kidney injury or bleeding. And we're making some forays, which I'll go into, on how do we capture patient-reported outcomes in a way that can be used to feed back to sites. So I can't give a talk without referring to door-to-balloon times and sort of the DTB alliance that emerged from it. But if you go way back to 2000, increasing recognition that timeliness of reperfusion was very important, that mortality was almost a linear function of how long it takes us to open up the coronary artery in the setting of an acute myocardial infarction. And as Bob McNamara identified many years ago, times had been resistant to change, that there was a very steady state where it took us somewhere 100 to 110 minutes to get door-to-balloon times for most of our patients with AMI. A whole world of research had taken place to identify 6 specific strategies that were associated with shorter door-to-balloon times. And there seemed to be synergy such that the more strategies hospitals adopted, the lower the door-to-balloon time. So this is work coming from not specifically the NCDR registry, but from registries. And it led to an ACC-driven initiative with AHA and other partner organizations that led to a revolution in the timeliness of reperfusion therapy. So over a relatively short period of time, the proportion of patients being revascularized within 90 minutes went from about 45% up to about 90%, which is still probably the best quality improvement initiative ever done anywhere that I'm aware of. But this isn't the only thing that we've done. So PCI appropriateness, are we doing the right thing by our patients when we're revascularizing them? Started with appropriate use criteria being developed and implemented in a way that could be captured in the registry. First person to publish this was Paul Chan out of JAMA in 2011, demonstrating that on average, 20% of our PCIs on non-emergent patients were characterized as non-appropriate or rarely appropriate. But then over time, with feedback to sites and efforts to improve documentation or justifications for our procedures, we actually made substantial gains in that. So this is a paper Nihar published in 2015 that showed that the proportion of these procedures that were characterized as appropriate or uncertain appropriate increased from 30% to 53% for appropriate procedures, and overall about 80 to 88% of procedures were characterized as appropriate or uncertain at the end of that time. So there was a significant change in practice, purely a result of capturing this data and feeding it back to sites. What do we need to do around quality measurement going forward? Well, certainly novel approaches to risk model development are necessary. We've been doing the same thing for a long time: logistic regression, figure out what's associated with it, calculate some sort of risk standardized outcome rate, and send it back to sites. But there are novel approaches that I think can refine the way we're doing it. And Rohan, I probably should have taken one of the many examples that you've done, but in this case, I used one from Shenxi Wang at Core, where she looked at the risk model for predicting acute kidney injury after percutaneous coronary intervention. And she used machine learning techniques and compared it to a traditional risk model. So I'm not going to go through the details of it, but I will say that it didn't identify necessarily all that more number of variables that were statistically associated with the outcome of interest, nor did it really improve the C statistic of the models. So that those were pretty much the same. What it did, though, is it did discriminate differently. And so while this looks like they're identical, that there was no improvement with machine learning, this actually shows that that some patients who had been identified as being very low risk for AKI in the overall model, actually in the refined model, had substantially higher risk of mortality, so or acute kidney injury. So there are things that we can do using novel techniques that should be incorporated more broadly into our suite of registries. The other piece was looking at patient-reported outcomes. So PCIs are ideal for patient-reported outcomes because for most patients, particularly those with stable coronary syndromes, the primary benefit is to improve functional status and symptom burden, less so harder outcomes like MI and death. So we had worked with the CMS and CORE to partner with the ACC in part to identify and describe whether or not a measure of patient-reported outcomes could be created. To do that, we focused on the Seattle Angina Questionnaire and the Rose Dyspnea Scale, which, not surprisingly, are also the ones that are captured on a voluntary basis in the CAP-PCI case report. We decided that we would use a minimally important difference as identifying the outcome of interest. So if your SAC score increased or got better by 5 points, and or your dyspnea scale got better by 1 point, we said that was a minimally important difference that would help justify the proportion, the performance of that procedure. And when we actually did a pilot of this in Seattle or in Washington State, we did see at participating hospitals that there was pretty significant variation in the observed improvement rate across hospitals. So that the actual rate varied from, I think it was 66% over to 91% of the proportion of patients who had that minimally important difference improvement in symptoms after PCI for stable coronary disease. So I think that's one area that we can move in over time. The second thing is cost. How do we help get that cost equation, that value equation back to sites. And so we did a pilot looking at providing total charges to sites around PCI. And to do that, we had to partner with Fair Health because our registry is only around the index hospitalization for PCI, but we wanted to take a broader view. So we partnered with Fair Health, who's a data aggregator, and we kind of captured charges in the pre-hospital, index hospital, and post-hospitalization buckets and created benchmarks that allow determination of charges and costs across hospitals. So what we got was something like this, which is at each hospital that was participating, they could be identified as to the cost or the charged amount per PCI procedure on average at that hospital. So this was useful, but there were significant limitations. So it wasn't direct patient level data available to our sites. And more importantly, it couldn't be linked back to the CAP PCI registry. So we couldn't make an explicit link between what was going on inside the hospital and the associated attendant costs and charges. So it was a good first step, but it's still something that we really need to figure out how to do better, how to, again, help our sites answer the question on the value proposition. So I'm going to close a little bit by talking about research within the registry, which is sort of the most fun thing. We are an observational research organization. We identify gaps in care. We identify comparative effectiveness research opportunities. And there have been over 500 peer-reviewed scientific publications out of the suite of registries in very impactful journals. The research enterprise, despite its success, needs to evolve. And so at present time, research is conducted at established data analytics centers. Here, Duke, Boston, Mid-America Heart Institute have been historically the ones that have participated. And the advantage to that is that there's statistical and clinical expertise in these organizations that mitigates risk, right? It's less likely that the inappropriate methods are going to be used. It's less likely that inappropriate conclusions will be drawn. The downside is that it's both expensive and slow and acts as a filter of sorts. So we're trying to move to a different model or a complementary model where the DACs aren't going away. Rohan, your job is safe. But we're trying to make steps into participant use file model or a PUF model. So again, democratization of data access to do this cheaper and faster so that more people can get engaged with the registry and ideally feel more engaged with participation in quality improvement efforts as a result of that. The devil's in the details. So how do we provide adequate oversight? How do we ensure privacy? And then issues of data ownership resulting from PUF-related data. But this is where we're going to go. We're starting with the impact registry, which is around congenital disease, probably expand through TBT, and eventually establish PUF models for all of our registries. Finally, let's talk a little bit about comparative effectiveness research. So, or two things actually. So the registries capture thousands of different devices, and it's very tempting to use this information for device-to-device comparisons. But of course, with any observational data, there's concern about causal inference and confounding by indication, such that we have in place policies that limit device-to-device comparisons. And they actually set a specific threshold that has to be done in conjunction or in partnership with a governmental agency that establishes that this analysis is critical for patient health, patient safety. And it's actually, a couple of these have been very impactful. So this is work that Fred Resnick did around vascular closure devices within the registry, and it's done as part of FDA-funded Delta project examining the outcomes of different vascular closure devices. What they found using the Delta methodology was one device out of the, I think, 7 that were analyzed had consistently a higher risk of adverse outcomes and vascular complications than the other devices. And eventually it led to that device being withdrawn from the market. The second I'll refer to is around the Impella analysis, but it started kind of with an interesting look at the use of balloon pumps in high-risk PCI patients, where we identified a lot of variation in the use of balloon pumps in this population without any evidence of benefit for balloon pumps, either with mortality or vascular complications or anything else. And so we concluded at that time that our findings provide no evidence to support the greater use of balloon pumps at some hospitals and indicate a pressing need to further define the settings in which this intervention provides a net benefit. These conclusions were ultimately supported by the SHOCK 2 trial and should have, I thought, maybe put this whole issue to rest. But then had to do the whole thing over again with the Impella story. So the use of this very expensive technology that had achieved approval without a real clear pivotal trial showing benefit and was adopted rapidly. Through the FDA CIRSE-funded analysis, Sanket Dhruva, former fellow here, in conjunction with Nihar and other investigators at Yale, conducted this analysis that identified a clear safety signal around the use of Impella in the setting of cardiogenic shock complicating myocardial infarction. And I thought that this probably was the most impactful paper that I would ever be a part of. The day that it was presented at AHA, there was a $1.2 billion loss in value of the company, which seemed appropriate given the findings. But a little dismayed that J&J just bought the Abiomed company for $16.6 billion in cash. So perhaps not quite as impactful as I'd hoped. Nevertheless, important to do, important in terms of steering the conversation around the safety of these devices that may not be super well studied. And we do a lot of work with the FDA in terms of post-approval studies and a little bit around the pre-market space. But the final thing I want to talk about is what can we do around trials. So registry-based pragmatic clinical trials hold the promise of increasing the number and speed of clinical trials with gains of efficiency, reducing costs to all parties involved. Hypothetically, the NCDR infrastructure could or maybe should be central to registry-based clinical trial initiatives, but it does require pragmatism, and we don't have a functioning model at this point. I think the best example of this within the cardiovascular space is the CTSN, or the Cardiothoracic Surgical Network, which conducts impactful clinical randomized trials at selected sites using a variation of a registry model. It's been done. So Mitch Krukoff and others did SAFE PCI with Sunil Rao, randomizing women undergoing PCI to femoral or radial access. And it actually proved effective in terms of we could do it, we could get the data adjudicated, we could do it in a way that was compliant with FDA requirements, we could do it faster than most clinical trials could be attained with reduced site workload for the clinical trialists at those sites. And it was done very cheaply. So this trial was done for $5 million as opposed to $20 to $40 million for most randomized trials. The problem was that it kind of stopped there, that there was no sustainability to it. And so under the auspices or under the collaboration with the MD EpiNet team and the Cardiovascular Research Foundation, we're trying to do version 2 of this. And so Pragmatic PACE is a trial that's being proposed that can be embedded within the TVT registry, that's simple, that only requires short-term outcomes applicable to the large proportion of TAVR patients, so ideally rapid enrollment and highly generalizable, with potential to embed new device approvals within the registry. So it was based on this observation that some sites have just started using pacing through the wire used to deliver the device. So instead of putting a temporary wire through the venous system, they're simply attaching a pacemaker box to the wire and pacing through the left ventricle as opposed to the right ventricle. And it's never been tested. There's variation across the country in terms of the adoption of this technique. And so they're proposing that we actually do a registry-based, open-label, randomized trial nested within TVT that will really be fairly feasible because it's only going to require at this point one additional data element, but that will randomize these patients and ultimately identify whether or not this is a safe, effective strategy for pacing at the time of TAVR implantation. The problem will be, how do we sustain it, right? So to make this sustainable, we need a pipeline of impactful, feasible clinical trials. Funding remains the primary barrier. Nobody wants to be the first to put the money in the pot for this, otherwise modestly unproven effort. So we need to establish the value to the industry. And we're still exploring governmental options, either NIH, who funds the CTSN, FDA through some form of CIRSE funding, or if we can have a more patient-centered approach, perhaps PCORI. So I'm going to close in the 2 minutes that I have left, but just putting a challenge to all of you, and an opportunity to the members of the audience here, which is that there are lots of opportunities to get involved with the NCDR. And it is, I think, used by a lot of people at this organization, more than at most hospitals, but there's still additional room. So on the right, you've got all the different committees within the ACC that touch or fall under the umbrella of the NCDR. Every registry has its own steering committee. Every registry has its own research and publications committee. And then there are other committees around oversight and science and quality and measurement and things like that. We just went through this nomination cycle. So there were 53 open positions on these committees. There were only 110 applicants for those positions. And that's a 50-50 chance, which isn't bad. So it's an opportunity to get involved, to engage with the broader cardiovascular community outside of Yale, and for many people has proven very valuable to their careers and their academic progression. So I will say that please do apply. The portal usually opens sometime in late August and stays open for about 4 weeks. You can self-nominate, but you won't be considered unless you have a nomination letter of reference of support from somebody else who's eligible, an actual fellow of the college. So please take advantage of it and select your reference well, and make sure that it goes in before the deadline, otherwise you won't be considered. Second thing is submit your research proposals. The NCDR has funding, free dollars for individual research proposals that are being prepared. They're hard to get. The funding, I think, is probably around 15% right now. But if you have a good proposal and you have a qualified mentor, there is a high likelihood, and we've been very successful over the years, to getting research funding. And then I think the final thing is opportunity to engage with Rohan and the RDEC. Now rebranded as the CHIA project, which I'm not sure about. But there's the need for clinical consultative services and clinical leads on individual research projects coming out of this registry. Fellows have taken advantage of this. Eula Castro, who graduated 2 years ago, was very involved in multiple measure developments. Emily Wong is doing a similar thing with the left atrial appendage occlusion. There are opportunities. So if you're interested, reach out, identify your interest or signal your interest, and ideally we can get you involved. So I'm going to close just saying cardiac registries play an important role in the delivery of healthcare. They're not going anywhere. They lead to quality improvement, they allow measurement of quality, and they allow knowledge generation. But we do need to evolve our approaches so that there are new approaches within each of these domains. There are threats that do exist, and we're going to have to evolve or risk extinction. Hopefully, if we adhere to and meet the optimization plan goals, we'll ensure our success for the next 25 years. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jepsa, for a terrific talk and discussion of the entire portfolio. Are there questions from the audience here or those online? We've had a large attendee pool today. Over 80 people joined online. So happy to take questions online or in person here. Maybe I'll start. So Jepsa, the challenge of, as you alluded to, innovation is from the worry about being able to measure aspects automatically in an automated fashion with high quality and fidelity, which the registries are known to do. How would that portfolio differ from a human abstraction process if we had enough of a strategy for auditing built in? Would a similar audit that we do using abstraction at the college level from across sites be sufficient as an investigator for you to adjudicate the quality of something that had not been done by a human this time around, but being done by a machine?
So it's a good question. I don't know that I can answer that off the cuff. I'll have to think about that a little bit. I will say that I think if we are going to go with NLP and automatic abstraction of data, I think we'll have to evolve the types of data elements that we choose to put into those case report forms is probably the most important thing. Because we limit the things that we use around to minimize the burden. We limit the number of labs that we require. We limit some of the demographics or otherwise. But different types of data are more higher fidelity and probably easier to extract using NLP than others. And so we'd have to take advantage of it. The things that would be, I think, really almost impossible to extract, NHYA classifications, right? Or NYHA classification. So, that's something that's important prognostically, historically, something almost impossible for human abstractors to get on a reliable basis, and probably impossible for natural language processing to actually do in a way that's reproducible, I would think, or consistent across sites. So I think that's probably the fundamental thing. And then what I suspect is that the models would actually work quite similarly, but we'd have to make sure that it's the same across sites. Hello, Francine. And then I think Keith also has a question.
So Jeff, I think you started out, or at least talking about the cost associated with it, right? And viability. I do think, and we feel very strongly here, as you know, that registries are key to the work we do and the outcomes, and we've been able to adjust practice through the years. I think AI is absolutely, and I think we have an advantage in that we have quite a very strong, on both sides of the street, IT infrastructure, that I think that is the way we need to evolve. And I also think we need to continue to take advantage of our EMRs and because the people manual process for all of us is not going to be sustainable. And I think, and you might even find better data integrity moving forward in the future if we find a way to do it. And again, I'm not that kind of person, that I don't have that brain, but I think outcomes is where we need to go. And the advantage that we have here, which differentiates us, is we have the research that you and our colleagues all engage in. So that's why I think we need to push and invest in versus continuing manual. It's not sustainable.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's where I think probably will land is something along a hybrid, where you do as much automatic extraction as possible. But if there are key elements that really prove challenging, that there is a human element that remains. And I think that is, and I think the other thing that we may underestimate, and Rohan, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, is sort of the maintenance of these links, right? So how do we ensure that it's, it'll continuously evolve, or it'll evolve as much as we allow it to evolve for NLP. But how do we make sure that it's measuring the same thing over time? And that's going to take its own sets of resources. So it's not necessarily, no resources versus very intense resources. There's definitely a middle ground to be achieved.
Well, actually, we've had Keith on, and then Keith, please go ahead.
So thank you and good morning. And Jeff, thank you for a great talk. Question, as the ACC has utilized this database and have adjudicated and evaluated at multiple labs, multiple institutions across the years, has there ever been a case where the data for an institution was so poor that a recommendation was made that they would stop doing intervention or stop doing any particular procedure? And is there a pathway that the ACC uses to actually adjudicate that in terms of their overall evaluation of the data?
So I think the answer is no from the ACC side of things, right? There has been, that's not really part of what we say that we should do, right? There are two aspects of it. One is which is the cross-link to the accreditation services within the ACC. So, they credit for things like AFib and chest pain centers and things like that. And so NCDR data is wrapped into those accreditations frequently. And so that's one place where it can be obvious that if you aren't achieving the benchmarks that you want to achieve, that may lead the institution to think more about what they're doing and should they be in that space. I think the second piece is the collaborations with states, right? So I think the poster child was the collaboration with Maryland, around the aggregation of NCDR data at within the state and comparing it both within as well as to national standards. And the reality of that was stimulated by the Medea case, where there's a ton of inappropriate cases being performed. So that could be, and I don't know that that's ever happened within Maryland, but I know that they're actively monitoring that. California has a similar program using NCDR data for both CAF-PCI and the TBT registry. So those regulatory bodies are probably in a better position to say go, no go than the ACC.
I'm going to have John go next, maybe just the next couple of minutes, be over time.
Jeff, just a quick question. I think it's done. You guys have done a great job with sort of short-term 30-day or hospital things, but so many questions around these devices and interventions, whether it's left atrial appendage or TAVR or PCI, really are in the longer term outcomes where we lack great data. Has there been discussions around the ACC's role in that and trying to look at longer term? Or are they really sticking to the short term in hospital 30-day and in rare occasions 1 year?
So, I mean, I think you're asking more from a research perspective, I think, than from a quality perspective. I mean, you could take a long-term view on quality, but that's not something that's easily done. The follow modules are tough for hospitals, right? And I think the one that goes out the farthest is left atrial appendage. We're being asked to, because of the CMS mandate, to follow our patients up to 2 years and submit that data, which arguably may or may not be too long or too short for that particular procedure. But I think if we're talking about burdens to sites, that is going to be intolerable to sites if they have to be following their patients up to 5 years. So what we need is something that's more passive and takes advantage of other links. And so we've done that, and TBT registry has done that. All the registries at this point have been linked with CMS data in the fee-for-service population. Now, that's useful, but it's incomplete. And that really sort of reflects the gaps that we have in our ability to do surveillance, long-term surveillance, because we have no consistent way of following our patients. We're not Denmark, we're not Sweden. We don't have the infrastructure to coordinate all the data across all the payers in a way that's really sustainable. So I would say we'd love to do that. We have partnered with organizations. I think Symphony is another data aggregator that we had been working with quite aggressively to try and get that longer term perspective. But the sustainability of those efforts is challenging. Yeah, Erica? Oh, we went way over, sorry.
So it seems like, because I'm focused in the ambulatory space, and there are so many other companies that are aggregating our data for quality performance measures, and the data quality is the main concern. And we perform really poorly on these measures, but also when we go to do our quality checks, the data quality are really poor too. So and we leave a lot of money on the table because we're participating in these value-based care contracts, and yet are performing poorly. So one of the things that it feels like it's a sliver of like the total ambulatory care measures, but it would provide a blueprint for high quality data capture for a lot of the performance measures that we participate in. And I wonder if there's like more, thought strategic alignment with the performance quality measures where health systems are going to be losing money because there is more of a business case to participate in these higher quality registries to get better data extraction and such.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example we have of that right now is the CAF-PCI registry, where Anthem is using it in for performance programs. And I think that's seen as a value added. I think that was one of the reasons why we started participating in that registry back 12, 13 years ago. So again, that's sort of the entanglements and how do you broaden them and yet evolve them at the same time is going to be the challenge. So it started off strong with Anthem, but it hasn't necessarily evolved, and the interest of other payers in the registry suites of measures has not sort of taken off as we'd hoped. So we're always looking for new opportunities to partner. We do feel like the data is valid and that is a major advantage. But I think the flip side particularly going back to the ambulatory space, is there's a reason we exited the ambulatory space, or sold it to Veradigm. We're still partnering with them on the research component, but we're not running the day-to-day operations of it. And the reason is that, as I talked about earlier, the continued updating of the mapping to the EHRs is prohibitive. And so it takes so much effort for an individual practice. If something changes within their EHR, suddenly everything disappears. So there's a huge hidden cost of maintenance and those things that shouldn't be underestimated, because FigMD or other aggregators like that have huge struggles, as you articulated. So thank you very much to everyone. I really
Thank you.
appreciate the time and consideration and humoring me as I went through this.
So thanks so much. Thanks, Chapter. So next, no, we went over. Next week we have the AHA update, and then we'll break for Thanksgiving. Thank you.